The midnight visitors. The gas station sat at the edge of town, where the cracked asphalt gave way to an endless stretch of dark, empty highway. Halloween night was always quiet here, which suited me just fine. No pranks, no drunk teenagers, just a heavy silence that settled around me like a thick fog. The only sounds were the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. It was close to midnight, and I was starting to count down the minutes until I could lock up and head home. That's when the bell above the door chimed, and a man walked in. He looked out of place, too clean, too well-dressed for a roadside gas station. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were blank, like they weren't seeing me at all. He made a beeline for the counter, not a single sound coming from his shoes as he walked across the tiled floor. His movements were stiff, mechanical, like he was barely holding himself together. When he reached the counter, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his gaze unwavering and unblinking. "Can I help you?" I asked, forcing a smile that felt tight and unnatural. He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised a hand and placed a small, crumpled piece of paper on the counter. I looked down, and my stomach twisted. Written in shaky, blood-red letters were the words, "They're coming. Asterisk, asterisk." I looked up, but he was already gone, slipping back into the night without a sound. My heart was pounding, a cold sweat breaking out along my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a prank, someone's twisted idea of Halloween fun. But then, as I glanced back at the note, I realized the ink was still wet, sticky like fresh blood. The bell chimed again, snapping me out of my thoughts. A woman this time, wearing a tattered dress, her hair hanging limp and wet around her face. She looked like she'd crawled out of a swamp, her skin gray and mottled, with patches of something black and slimy clinging to her arms. She shuffled closer, dragging one foot behind the other. The air grew colder with each step she took, and the smell of decay hit me like a wave. I backed up against the wall, my eyes darting to the phone on the counter, but something in her gaze froze me in place. Her eyes were empty, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. She stopped a few feet away and opened her mouth. A deep, guttural moan escaped her, low and rumbling, like the growl of something that should have been buried long ago. My skin prickled, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as she raised a hand, pointing a bony finger at me, Dot. And then she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, splitting the corners of her mouth until blood began to trickle down her chin. The bell chimed again, and I blinked, breaking free from whatever trance had held me. I stumbled back, and when I looked up, she was gone, leaving only a wet, dark trail on the floor where she'd stood. My hand shook as I reached for the phone, but it was dead, the line cut off. I backed away, glancing around the small store, every shadow suddenly deeper, every corner hiding something waiting to pounce. The clock on the wall ticked louder, each second hammering into my skull as I realized I was trapped here, alone, with no way to call for help. A cold breeze swept through the room, and I felt something brush past me, a whisper of a touch, cold and damp. I turned, but there was nothing there, only the reflection of the empty store in the window. But then in the reflection, I saw them. Shadows, figures moving behind the shelves, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They were watching me, waiting, and I knew with a sickening certainty that the man's note had been a warning. They were coming, and they were already here. The store felt smaller now, the walls pressing in around me as I struggled to catch my breath. My heart was racing, and every instinct screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was only a few feet away, but something told me that whatever waited outside was far worse than what lurked in here. The bell above the door chimed again, but this time no one entered. Instead, the lights flickered, casting the room in an erratic, strobe-like glow. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and stretching, taking on shapes that shouldn't have been there. In the brief moments of darkness, I could swear I saw faces, hollow, twisted faces, staring back at me. I grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I swept it across the store, the shelves casting long, eerie shadows. The light landed on the back corner of the store, and I froze. There, crouched behind the rack of potato chips, was a figure, hunched and gnarled, like it had been broken and pieced back together in all the wrong ways. Its head snapped up, its eyes catching the light. They were black, soulless pits, and in them I saw nothing but hunger. It began to crawl toward me, its limbs moving in unnatural, jerking motions. As it moved, I could hear the sickening crunch of bones grinding against each other, like it was dragging itself forward on broken limbs. I stumbled back, slamming into the counter, and the flashlight slipped from my grasp, rolling across the floor. Darkness swallowed the room once more, and I scrambled to grab the light, my fingers fumbling on the cold, dirty tiles. I heard it getting closer, its raspy breath filling the air, mingling with a putrid stench that made me gag. Finally, I found the flashlight and snapped it back on, swinging it up just as the figure loomed over me. It was inches away now, its face so close I could see the cracked, leathery skin, the jagged teeth stained with something dark and foul. It let out a low, guttural hiss, reaching a clawed hand toward me. I lashed out, grabbing the closest thing I could find, a can of soda from the counter, and hurled it at the creature. It connected with a dull thud, and the thing staggered back, giving me just enough time to dart around it and race toward the back of the store. I threw myself into the storage room, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I shoved a metal shelf in front of the door, creating a makeshift barricade. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, but the air in the room was thick, stale, suffocating. In the corner, I noticed a small, dusty window. It was barely large enough to crawl through, but it was my only way out. I climbed onto a stack of boxes, reaching up to unlatch the window. My fingers fumbled with the rusted lock, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, with a sharp click, it gave way, and I pushed the window open, the cold night air rushing in. I started to pull myself through, but something caught my ankle, yanking me back into the room. I twisted around, my eyes widening in horror as I saw a hand, a pale, skeletal hand reaching out from the darkness, its grip like ice around my skin. I kicked and thrashed, but its grip only tightened, pulling me closer to the floor. I let out a scream, raw and desperate, clawing at the walls, the boxes, anything to keep from being dragged back. The thing in the darkness snarled, a guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine, and with one last burst of strength, I kicked out, connecting with something solid. The grip loosened, and I scrambled back, my hands scraping against the rough concrete floor as I pulled myself free. I didn't look back. I crawled through the window, dropping onto the gravel outside, the cold air biting into my skin. I pushed myself up, my legs unsteady, and stumbled away from the building, every step a struggle as I gasped for air. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the road where the old payphone stood, half hidden by weeds. I reached for the receiver, my hands shaking, and lifted it to my ear. But as soon as I pressed it to my head, I realized there was no dial tone, only a low, crackling static. And then through the static, I heard it. A voice, whispering my name, soft and sinister, like it was coming from just behind me. I spun around, the phone slipping from my fingers, and in the glow of the gas station lights, I saw them. They were standing in the parking lot watching me. Not just the man and the woman from earlier, but others too. Shadows that twisted and swayed, figures that seemed barely human, with eyes that glowed in the darkness. They were waiting, and I knew with a sinking dread that they weren't done with me yet. This was only the beginning. I backed away from the payphone, every muscle tense as I kept my eyes fixed on the figures in the parking lot. They were standing perfectly still like statues, but their eyes followed my every move. The road stretched out behind me, a black ribbon disappearing into the darkness. But I knew running wasn't an option. I was alone, miles from anyone who could help, and they'd find me no matter where I went. As I edged away, the shadows began to move, gliding closer, their shapes shifting in the dim light. One of them, a tall, gaunt figure with limbs that seemed too long, lifted a hand and pointed directly at me. I felt a chill wash over me, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Suddenly they began to advance, moving with an unnatural grace, their feet barely touching the ground. I turned and ran, darting back toward the gas station, hoping I could lose them among the aisles. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, but I knew it wouldn't hold them for long. I scanned the room, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusted crowbar hanging from a hook near the counter. I grabbed it, the metal cold and heavy in my hand. My breath came in ragged gasps as I braced myself, listening for any sound that would tell me they'd breached the door. And then, there it was, a soft creak, like the whisper of footsteps on the tiles. I tightened my grip on the crowbar, raising it above my head as I backed toward the storage room. The air grew colder, the light overhead flickering until it finally went out, plunging me into darkness. I heard them moving, the faint rustle of clothing, the soft scrape of nails against the floor. My chest tightened as the darkness closed in around me, every shadow shifting, every corner hiding something waiting to strike. I raised the flashlight again, the beam cutting through the dark, and there they were, standing just a few feet away, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. I swung the crowbar, the metal whistling through the air, but it passed right through them, as if they were nothing but smoke. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance, and they closed in, surrounding me, their faces twisting into grins that stretched far too wide. And then something strange happened. One by one, they began to speak, their voices layered and overlapping, filling the room with a cacophony of whispers. They spoke of things that made my skin crawl, tales of violence and despair, stories of people who had come here and never left. Each word was like a knife, cutting into my mind, filling me with a terror I couldn't shake. I dropped the crowbar, clutching my head as their voices grew louder, echoing through my skull. My knees buckled and I sank to the floor, my vision blurring as they circled around me, their eyes flashing with something dark and ancient. I felt their cold breath on my skin, the faint brush of fingers against my face, and I knew they were toying with me, drawing out my fear, savoring it. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up, my heart skipping a beat as I saw a familiar face. It was the first customer, the pale man with the waxy face standing in the doorway. He held up his hand and the other figures stopped, their voices fading into silence as they turned to face him. He stepped forward, his movements stiff and mechanical, and as he drew closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. His skin wasn't just pale, it was translucent, stretched thin over a network of veins that pulsed with a sickly greenish light. His eyes were dark, empty pits, and when he opened his mouth, I saw rows of sharp, needle-like teeth glinting in the faint light. He knelt down in front of me, his face inches from mine, and I could feel the cold radiating off him, seeping into my bones. He reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder, his grip like iron, and I felt an intense, searing pain that shot through my body. I tried to pull away, but his fingers dug deeper, holding me in place as he leaned in, his breath foul and rotten. "You should have left when you had the chance," he whispered, his voice barely more than a hiss. "But now, you belong to us." The figures around him began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, filling the air with a dark, pulsing energy. I felt myself growing weaker, my limbs heavy, my vision fading as the world around me began to blur. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was his face, grinning down at me, his eyes glowing with a twisted satisfaction. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the cold, hard floor, my body aching, every muscle stiff and sore. I tried to sit up, but something held me down, a weight pressing against my chest, suffocating me. I looked around, and that's when I realized I wasn't alone. They were standing over me, their faces blank and expressionless, their eyes fixed on me with a chilling intensity. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, my voice caught in my throat as they closed in, their hands reaching for me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. And then I felt it, a cold, sharp pain as something pierced my skin, a deep, searing agony that spread through my body like fire. I struggled, thrashing against their grip, but they held me down, their hands like iron, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. As the darkness swallowed me, I realized there was no escape. They had me, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I was theirs, a prisoner in my own mind, trapped in a nightmare that I knew would never end. The last thing I heard was their laughter, cold and hollow, echoing through the darkness as they dragged me deeper, into a place from which I knew I would never return. As the darkness closed in around me, I felt myself sinking, drifting deeper into the cold emptiness. But just when I thought I was lost, something changed. A warm, gentle light began to glow in the distance, faint at first, but growing stronger, cutting through the shadows like a beacon. I felt a strange, comforting warmth spread through my body, chasing away the chill that had settled in my bones. I opened my eyes and found myself lying on the floor of the gas station, bathed in a soft, golden light. The terrifying figures were gone, and the room felt different, calm, almost serene. I pushed myself up, wincing at the lingering aches in my muscles, and noticed a familiar face standing in the doorway. It was an old man I'd seen around town, someone who always wore a smile and had a kind word for everyone. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice warm and soothing, a stark contrast to the cold whispers that had haunted me moments before. I nodded, still shaken but relieved beyond words. I think so," I managed, glancing around the room to make sure I was really alone. "What happened? They were here, and I thought—" "They've been trying to claim this place for a long time," the old man said, stepping closer. "But tonight something changed. You weren't alone. I was keeping an eye on you." I stared at him, the pieces slowly clicking into place. He'd been watching over me, somehow keeping those dark forces at bay. "Why would you help me?" he smiled, a twinkle in his eye. "Because no one should face this kind of darkness alone. It's Halloween, after all, the night when spirits roam free. But not all spirits are here to harm. Some of us are here to protect." He held out his hand, and when I took it, a surge of warmth flowed through me, banishing the last remnants of fear. "You're safe now," he said softly. "They won't bother you anymore. Their power here is broken." I took a deep breath, letting his words sink in, and for the first time that night, I felt a sense of peace. The terror was gone, replaced by a profound gratitude for this stranger who had risked himself to save me. Thank you, I whispered, tears pricking at my eyes. I don't know what I would have done without you. The old man just nodded, his expression kind and understanding. Go home, he said, his voice gentle. Rest. This place won't hold any more nightmares for you. As I left the gas station, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold. I walked down the empty road, the world around me bright and alive, a far cry from the cold darkness that had held me captive just hours before. I never saw the old man again, but I knew deep down that he had been more than just a passerby. He was a guardian, a protector, someone who had chosen to stay behind and watch over a place that had once been a gateway to something dark and terrible. And as I made my way home, I knew that no matter what haunted my past, I had faced it and survived. The darkness was gone, chased away by a light stronger than fear, and in its place I found a new strength, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always a glimmer of hope waiting to guide us back to safety.